Welcome to Interface. My name is Tembisa Machele. Well, last year, former first-rank CEO Mr. Sizwe Nxasana was announced as the new chairman of the board of the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, NSFAS. There were great hopes that he would steer the ship and the scheme towards better efficiency, but as expected, 2016 has had a bit of a shaky start for many of our universities and for the financial aid scheme, and this as students intensify their calls for free education. Mr. Nxasana is our guest on Interface tonight as we get his views on this subject, but before we chat to him, let's take a quick look at this insert compiled by our Interface producer Zamabutelis.
Funding at South Africa's tertiary institutions continue to be challenging. Last year, government set up a task team to address funding problems at tertiary institutions. The task team identified 4 key factors that could lead to potential protest this year. These included most students battle to raise money to pay registration upfront. Students whose parents earn between 120,000 and 300,000 per year do not qualify for NSFAS funding. The scheme plans to fund at least 405,000 students this year.
Government has committed an additional 6.912 billion funding to support university education in the system. That's over and above the 10 billion rand.
I think that 6.9 billion goes a long way. It's very valuable to what we have, but it doesn't resolve the problem of the missing middle. And that's the challenge. So additional 6.9 billion has been made available.
Yeah.
I think we could have started sooner. I think government should have addressed it. Some of us have been making this argument for a long period of time that we're heading for a disaster in higher education. We're underfunding higher education too heavily, and it's going to have an impact. So we could have moved quicker. But now they've begun to move. I think we have to recognize that this is going to be a process. We have to establish a set of processes and timelines, but we have to start moving towards resolving this issue.
Many students cannot be enrolled because of the limited spaces at varsities. Last year, the University of Johannesburg received more than 100,000 first-year applications, but the institution only had space for 10,500. As the fund grows, it is fraught with many problems, mainly ensuring that the funds are allocated to the right students, corruption and inefficiencies in the administration of loans and bursaries.
We saw some of the weaknesses, and that made the system to be vulnerable. In as much as we take it as our responsibility, but we also want now to start problematizing people that want to steal from the poor by submitting fraudulent documentation to access financial aid, because this is meant to help poor students and students from working class backgrounds. As NSFAS, our responsibility is to build robust and strong administrative system and to make sure that the assessment gives money to the students that really are in need.
The fund is also struggling to collect loans owed by more than 100,000 students. Students' loan repayment is calculated at 3% of your annual salary. It increases to 8% when your salary reaches 59,300 or more. For an example, this means you will pay 900 rands a year on a salary of 30,000 rands a year or 75 rands per month. Once your annual salary is 59,300, you will pay back 4,744 rands a year or 395 rands a month. NSFAS is working with SABC and government departments to establish whether graduates who owe money are employed or not. The scheme has also established an office tasked with collecting debts. The fund is also working with the Sector Education and Training Authority to find ways to help graduates to find employment in order to ensure that they repay their debt. Zamabtelezi for Interface at SABC.
As always, if you'd like to take part in our discussion, you can do so by visiting our social media pages. On Facebook, our page is at Interface on SABC, or on Twitter at Interface on SABC, or at Tembisa Machele. Mr. Nxasana, welcome to the program, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So 2016 seems to be a watershed year for South African tertiary education. We've heard a lot about students calling for free education. we know there's been a 0% increase for this year in terms of the fees. But what's your assessment of how this year is set to go for tertiary education?
Well, I think the starting point is really just taking from last year and some of the key decisions that were made, particularly by government last year. One, which is what you've just mentioned, which was to suspend any increases in fees for this year. And secondly, to make available funding, additional funding to funding that NSFAS was already receiving, to be able to cater for the historic debt, in other words, the debt that was accumulated between 2013 to 2015, and also to make available additional funding for those students who qualify for NSFAS funding who've been admitted at universities or those that are returning at universities for 2016 going forward. Clearly, we still operate on the basis that NSFAS provides a combination of loans and bursaries, so we're not at a stage yet where free education is given to poor students. We're still operating on the basis that 40% can be converted into a bursary and 60% remains as a loan, which is repayable by a student when they start earning income. So a huge amount has actually been done in the last 3 months to address the issues that affect particularly poor students.
Just a quick one on the free education. I mean, the students are really intensifying their calls for that. Is it something that you see as doable, you know, in the next year or two? Or is there a time frame that you think, you know, we can achieve that as a country?
Well, as we know, the president announced the appointment of Judge Heha, as well as, you know, supported by Advocate Eli and Ms. Kumalo, who are investigating as part of a commission that the president has appointed the feasibility of fee-free education. In other words, to investigate whether this country can afford to offer free education at a tertiary level. That commission is now in place. It has to do its work in terms of the mandate that it has been given by the president. They have to report in 8 months to the president what their findings are. And therefore, there certainly is an investigation in that regard.
Yes, but I'm asking your view in terms of how you think this can be feasible.
Well, my view is if we created an environment where funding could be sourced not just from the public sector, but also from the private sector and other sources, because there are other sources that are out there. There is, in fact, a possibility that free education could be provided to poor students. I think what we see at the moment, for instance, the total amount that NSFAS administers is almost 100%. In fact, it is 100% entirely coming from government. And I think we need to work very hard to bring other stakeholders that really are beneficiaries of what goes on in terms of the students that graduate, qualify, find employment, and so on, so that we can offer, you know, free education, especially to the desperately poor. And I think that funding obviously has to come with certain obligations. It has to come with obligations to study, to complete, but support must be provided to those students as well.
I'm glad you touched on business, and with your extensive experience in business, I'd love to get your thoughts on how we can get that sector involved or more involved in funding tertiary education. But we've got to take a short break. And remember, if you would like to take part in this discussion, you can do so on social media. We're back after this. So if you've just joined us, welcome to you. We're talking about funding at tertiary institutions, and our guest is NSFAS chairperson of the board, Sizwe Nxasana, and of course we are taking your thoughts on Facebook and on Twitter. So Mr. Nxasana, before the break we're talking about the role of business. You've got an extensive experience in business, having been CEO of First Rand, and there's been a lot of talk about whether or not business has done enough to try and assist with tertiary education. Some saying there are many bursaries being given by companies. You can't expect business to be doing any more than they are currently doing. And others saying because business are the main beneficiaries of these students that are coming out of university, they should be doing far more. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are a number of things since this issue around student fees started that business is doing already. It's not as if they were not doing anything before that. But just to give you an example, you know, Business Leadership South Africa, which represents about 82 or 85 of the largest companies in this country, collated information towards the end of last year to indicate or determine what large business particularly was doing. And it was quite clear that there's quite a lot that business is doing already. It may not be coordinated, it may need to be better coordinated in terms of where business may be giving support, especially with regards to poor students. So that information has been collated, and in fact a lot of discussions and meetings have taken place in the organized business community, from Business Unity SA right up to Business BLSA, as well as some of the industry bodies such as the Banking Association, the insurance industry, in terms of focusing their minds around how particularly poor students can be supported.
But should they be doing more?
Well, they're actually starting to do more.
Okay.
Just to give an example, you asked the question with my experience and background. I've interacted with business over the last 3 months quite extensively. And already just talking, for instance, about the efficiencies or improving efficiencies at NSFAS, business, particularly the Banking Association and the insurance industry now have come on board to support us in terms of making sure that we are operating more efficiently. In terms of the additional funding, already through the discussions that have taken place amongst organized business, they're looking at how coordination can actually take place and how funding particularly can be directed to poor students. The number of other areas in terms of investigating this whole area of additional funding support, but not just funding support, because students need more than, especially poor students, need more than just financial support. They need life skill support, they need employment, they need, for instance, internships and so on. So already you were in discussions with organized business, with all the business formations that I indicated earlier, that are prepared to come on board, that are starting to come on board to say, well, if we're going to increase the success rate, especially of poor students whose pass rate at the moment is really low. If you look at NSFAS funded students as an example, we have just over 60% dropout rate, which means, a lot of the funding that is made available is actually money down the drain. Yeah. So if we can improve the success rate of those students, they graduate, they find employment, we incentivize students and universities to focus on those skills that are going to lead to employment, we can actually improve the amount of students that get support. So we're already working on different mechanisms of how we can achieve that.
Let's talk a little bit about strategy, because the minister last year, the Minister of Higher Education, talked about some of the issues with NSFAS itself in terms of the leadership and the strategy that's not just delivering on what it's supposed to. We spoke to the CEO late last year and talked about some of the things that are being put in place. But in terms of your experience coming onto the board now, what's your strategy? What do you think you can bring to try and steer this ship?
Well, I'll talk about what we've already done in the last 3 months since I took over as chairman at NSFAS. We've brought, as I indicated earlier, the banking industry is already working with us, for instance, to improve the processes of originating new loans, obviously of rolling out the student-centered model, which we started piloting last year, of increasing, that student-centered model, of improving the processes within NSFAS itself in terms of how the loans are issued and how the collections of those loans actually happens. We already started working on that.
I'm interested in that. How are you going to make that different? What's going to happen with that?
Well, the number of things that we need to do here. For starters, we must understand that the universities are agents for NSFAS. In other words, students go and apply to universities. They go to the student support offices there. That's where they apply for the NSFAS funding, other than the, about 16,000 or so that are now on the new pilot that I spoke about earlier. So you can't just strengthen the processes at NSFAS itself, you go to strengthen the processes at universities as well, because that's where often the problems arise where, for instance, there may be corruption in certain cases, or universities may have their own rules that apply to NSFAS funded students or NSFAS qualifying students. So we've got to work with universities in that regard as well. But we've already started improving the efficiencies in as far as NSFAS and the NSFAS systems and platforms are concerned. We've put a lot of resources to make sure that the systems there work better than maybe what they've done and they've worked in the past. So the number of things that we are working on, in the whole value chain, right up to the collections, but also it is important, as I indicated earlier, to support the students when they're at university, because funding is only one component that allows the student to complete, succeed, and find employment at the end of the day.
One of the things you said in an interview last year, and you've just mentioned it now, is that you want NSFAS to be more student-centered. I would think that that's what they were always supposed to be. What do you mean by student-centered?
I mean, it is important that NSFAS serves the needs of the students, and not just the needs. It's important, of course, for NSFAS to work with universities. That's critical. But if you look at how the system works at the moment, the number of cases where, in fact, I'm dealing with a number of cases as we speak, where students that qualify for NSFAS funding, even after the president announced last week that no NSFAS qualifying student must be turned away. And the minister and the DG in the Department of Higher Education announced the same thing. But I have cases, even as of Friday, of students that qualify for NSFAS funding that went to universities and were turned away. So it is important, clearly, that we're serving the needs of the student.
But is the problem with NSFAS or is the problem with the universities themselves?
The problem is not with NSFAS. The problem is around the different interpretation of the NSFAS rules by the university.
Okay.
And very often, universities have their own rules. And I'm not suggesting here that universities must go beyond the admission rules and the admission numbers. As long as a student, and I have cases where a student has been accepted at university, they have letters of acceptance into a program. They have proof that their household or their parents or their people that look after them and below 122,000 rand, but they've been to the offices that they've been turned away. So there are cases like that, many, many cases like that.
Okay, we've got to take another short break. If you would like to take part, do join us on social media as we continue with this discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are wrapping up our discussion with Dr. Sizwe Nxasana, talking about the funding at tertiary institutions of South Africa. Of course, fees must fall, still trending on social media, and we would like to try and get to some solutions of what we can do to assist students. And if you've got some ideas, do hit us up on Facebook and also on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. So, as we were talking before the break, we're talking about just some of the efficiencies that you're putting in place at NSFAS. Coming to 2016, there's been a number of reports on how much NSFAS is making available for students. Can you just clarify for us, how much have you made available for needy students in 2016?
Right. The total budget that NSFAS has is mainly, in fact, it's 100% coming from government. So if you just take the numbers that had already been voted and allocated to NSFAS, that number is 10 billion rand. That number comes from national government, Department of Higher Education. There's some funding that comes from Department of Basic Education as well as provinces. But the total number is 10 billion rand. In addition to the 10 billion rand, after the student protests and obviously the attempt by government to resolve the issues, especially that affect the historic debt and those students that were underfunded, there's an additional 4.6 billion rand that has been made available. And that number has two components. The first component relates to what we call historic debt. In other words, the debt that had been accumulated by students that owe universities an amount of about just over 2.5 billion rand. And that debt accumulated from 2013, 2014, and 2015. That's the first part. The second part is those students that were underfunded or unfunded but qualify for NSFAS funding that are returning to universities this year. There's an additional just over 2 billion rand that has been made available, in addition to the 10 billion rand that we already have. And it is important to make a point here that amount, or at least the two amounts, the historic debt as well as the amount that is being made available for 2016, the additional amount that is, we're going to sign agreements with universities. We've already communicated with universities that we need the names, the ID numbers, the addresses, and information around the academic progress of those students, because what's going to happen is we, NSFAS, are going to sign agreements with those students. We, as part of the rules that would apply to this, if universities, for instance, had charged interest on those outstanding debts, the universities have been instructed to write off that interest. We will then sign agreements with those students and give them funding. And if those students pass, as we apply the same rules to those students as we do the existing NSFAS funding base, will convert 40% of that funding to scholarships. So the same rules will apply to the additional 4.6 billion rand as it applies to the students that were already funded by NSFAS.
One of the major bugbears in this whole fees must fall movement is what happens to those students that are too rich for NSFAS but too poor for the banks. We need to find solutions and funding for those students. What thoughts do you have on that?
Well, we started working on a solution to address those students are the so-called missing middle.
Right.
We started working on a solution to address that. And you may have seen in the January 8th statement of the President that we are looking at piloting next year in 2017 a model which is going to fund those students, which hopefully will be fully rolled out by 2018, which is going to cater for the students that are in exactly the category that you indicated, because we know there's a large number of students who fall under that category, and it is absolutely important that they are funded. From a NSFAS standpoint, obviously we work on the basis of the current mandate that we have with the means test, which says, a person must come from a family whose household income is 122,000 and less. But we are certainly working very hard to come up with a solution which is going to fund those students.
If you would just take us into your confidence on some of the discussions that are happening behind the scenes, as we've seen, there have been strained relations between the Department of Higher Education and the students. We know that there are other meetings and conversations going on between universities, yourselves, and all of the stakeholders in this process. What are some of the issues that you are grappling with, and what are some of the solutions that are being proposed to try and move this forward so that we get less distractions in 2016? Well,
the number of discussions that are taking place, because let's just start with the interaction and the interface as well as the interpretation of the policies or the laws and the guidelines that have been issued. I mentioned earlier that, very often we find inconsistent rules that are applied by universities when it comes to NSFAS funding. I'll talk, for instance, about the registration fees. It's been made very clear that those students who've been admitted to universities who qualify for NSFAS funding should not be charged registration fees. We still find cases where universities charge or demand registration fees. We found cases where, for instance, we give certain set of guidelines in terms of what the quantum of the NSFAS funding that's made available, to students, by student and so on. You find that universities may apply different rules in terms of how much they allocate to students. You have what is called top slicing. In other words, where universities will give far less than what has been allocated per student by NSFAS in a number of cases, as an example. Part of that may have to do with the limited funding which is made available by government, which is obviously because the number of students who qualify is much larger than what we, NSFAS, has been given. So the issue of underfunding of the tertiary sector is an issue which has been raised. It's an issue which, in fact, the presidential task team was tasked with to look at that issue. And it's quite clear that we need additional funding. But additional funding has been made available now. And it is important that we cover it.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'm sure we'll get you into the studio again to try and touch base with you later in the year to see how far you've come with maybe even trying to address some of the upcoming issues for the next financial year, because this is an issue that we carry from year to year in South Africa. But thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thank you for making the time to join us here on Interface. Unfortunately, I couldn't read any of your messages, but I promise that we will do that as soon as we are able to. Good night.